Okay, I think that's all my housekeeping taken care of. So if I could invite my colleague Robert Okinda to the stage, and he is going to kindly introduce our keynote for this afternoon. Over to you, Robert.
Okay, thank you very much, Marie Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. We are delighted to welcome our second keynote of the PCF, Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani, who will speak to us about designing for justice, embracing open pedagogies in the age of techno-solutionism. Dr. Jhangiani is the Vice Provost, Teaching and Learning at the Brook University in Canada, where he directs the Inclusive Education Research Lab and is affiliated with the Social Justice Research Institute. Dr. Jhangiani was raised in Bombay, India, and moved to Canada as an undergraduate intellectual student, where he went to earn his doctorate in social and personality psychology from the University of British Columbia. Prior to joining Brook University, Dr. Jhangiani served as Associate Vice President, Teaching and Learning at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, where he was the architect of Canada's first zero textbook cost degree program. Along with numerous other publications, he authored 3 open textbooks in psychology. A long-standing advocate for open education and the impact it can have on equity and inclusion, he has worked with post-secondary institutions across North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia to serve their capacity. In 2020, he served as an ambassador for the global advocacy of open educational resources with the International Council for Open and Distance Education. And in 2018, he was invited to speak at the United Nations on how open education can support the Sustainable Development Goals. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Jhangiani.
Wow. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you feeling? I should say Dumilang. It is a privilege to be with you here, all of you. I want to thank first our colleagues at the Commonwealth of Learning for the invitation to speak today. And also, of course, I wish to express my sincere thanks to our colleagues at the Botswana Open University and, of course, the Ministry of Higher Education for being such gracious and welcoming hosts. I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been to explore your beautiful country. Today, I hope to draw on scholarship and practice in critical digital pedagogy, in open education, and in ethics of technology to make a case for why, in an age of generative artificial intelligence and platform capitalism, it is imperative that we as open educators adopt a critical approach to embracing both open educational practices and technological advances such as artificial intelligence. And how, if we fail to adopt this critical approach, we will not only betray our shared values, but we will risk actually compromising our mission, which is to widen access, to unlock human potential, and to catalyze societal transformation. Like probably most of you in this room, I've dedicated most of my life, most of my career as a university professor and over the last 7 years as a university administrator to advancing open education globally. And my work, of course, is animated by Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as you will know, asserts that higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Now, of course, access challenges are multidimensional, they are contextual. Just yesterday, for example, I was in a session, and perhaps the speakers are in the room over here, but a colleague was discussing a really creative approach to overcoming the insufficient number of Kenyan Sign Language interpreters. In the past, I've worked with colleagues in places like the Yukon, where Indigenous students who reside in remote communities face a number of barriers. They don't have broadband internet access, and so they face both geographic and technological barriers to access to higher education, even within the North American context. And of course, as you all know, cost can certainly be a barrier, as can the opportunity cost, which I don't want to forget, especially when we fail to properly recognize and assess prior learning, whether this is non-formal or informal learning. But over the past 15 years or so, one of the barriers I have worked to tackle the most has to do with a very specific aspect of access, and that has to do with the affordability of course materials, such as textbooks. Now, there are many reasons why this has been such an issue that's been worthwhile to tackle, particularly in the North American context. But I would say one of them is that this is an issue that's emblematic of the subtle ways in which higher education, despite its promise and potential to serve as a tool to unlock human potential, to advance social and economic mobility, higher education continues to be structured in ways that are subtle or blunt to reinforce and replicate existing power hierarchies. So, for example, when my partner, Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani, who, by the way, is here at the conference and facilitating a workshop tomorrow on designing inclusive OER, when she and I conducted research on the affordability of course materials by surveying students across 12 different universities in British Columbia, our home province, we found that, as you can see over here, just over half reported not purchasing some of their required textbooks due to cost. Just over a quarter reported taking fewer courses or not registering for a specific course due to cost, and 17% reported dropping or withdrawing from a course, again, due to the high cost of course materials. And as research in different jurisdictions has shown time and time again, these kinds of unfortunate choices are much more likely to be made by marginalized students. So those could be students from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds, or those who are their first in their family to attend university, for example. Now, there's no big secret why textbook costs has been such an issue in North America. For one, the cost of required course of commercial textbooks overall themselves, it's risen by more than 3 or 4 times the rate of inflation for the last 30 or so years. And so that students have often been forced to choose between purchasing groceries and buying textbooks is very much an open secret. And so I will take the opportunity over here to quote the CEO of Cengage, one of the largest commercial textbook publishers in the world, who in 2018 said that there are millions of students out there who are making very painful trade-offs in the purchase of learning materials relative to paying the rent, paying for basic needs, food, etc. And that we, as an industry, have been chosen for a long time to basically ignore that, or have been more or less been paying lip service to them. And I share this quote because I often think about whether you can truly ever reconcile a primary duty to learners with a primary obligation to shareholders. So as an individual educator, of course, you do what you can. Certainly I authored several open textbooks. This is one, but I'm really happy with this one because this is now in its 4th edition. It's been adapted and it's reused across the world. And as an author of OER, many of you will be OER creators in the room as well. I always think about it as a gift that keeps giving. And every time it is adapted, every time it is remixed, it gets even more dear. Conducted research, of course, to look at the efficacy of OER that added to the now sizable literature that attests to how students assigned free and open educational resources typically outperform those, or actually I should say, typically they perform the same as those assigned expensive commercial textbooks. But in cases where they perform differently, it's actually those assigned free OER that outperform those assigned expensive commercial textbooks. And one of the reasons I love working with OER so much is research like this. This was a large-scale study in the United States, state of Georgia, with almost 22,000 students. And what it shows is that the very same marginalized students who are suffering disproportionately at the hands of the commercial textbook publishers are in fact disproportionately benefiting from the use of OER, both in economic and in educational terms. So when I when I assumed the role of Associate Vice Provost for Open Education at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in British Columbia, what my colleagues and I decided to do was move beyond the sporadic adoption of OER by individual educators, and instead supported the vertical integration of OER across the curriculum of an entire degree program. And in doing so, as Robert said, we launched the first of many zero textbook cost degree programs. These were all centered on the creation, adaptation, and adoption of OER. And as this slide depicts, over a 6-year period, this initiative, which now spans 8 different degree programs, bachelor's programs in design, in arts, for example, it has saved our students over there more than $15 million in textbook costs. But even more impressively, I would say, these cost savings do not come at the cost of learning outcomes, because students enrolled in zero textbook cost, or ZTC sections, continue to earn higher grades on average. Now, in case you wish to learn more, these results are outlined in this paper that we published just a couple of months ago in the journal Open Praxis. And of course, I also want to give a shout out to a colleague, Amanda Gray, who's in the audience as well. Amanda, you can wave perhaps. Amanda's the open education strategist at KPU, and she continues to shepherd this important program. But of course, cost savings, whether these are enjoyed by individual students like at KPU or by institutions, if you're talking about centrally designed distance learning courses where the university is responsible for shipping the textbooks to students, these significant savings, I would suggest, are in many ways the least significant benefit of OER. For as Sarah Lambert wrote about in this journal, in this article, in the Journal of Learning for Development, with open education, we need to think not only about redistributive justice, which involves allocating resources, material or human, towards those who by circumstance have less, such as through the adoption of OER, but we also need to think about recognitive justice. This has to do with recognition and respect for cultural and gender difference. We also need to think about representational justice, and that has to do with equitable representation and political voice. Here's a good example in my mind of what recognitive justice looks like in my home discipline of psychology. This is where faculty members are taking advantage of the permissions associated with open licensing to revise and remix OER for history of psychology textbooks to rectify the underrepresentation of historically marginalized psychologists. Mine is a discipline that academically has engaged in quite a lot of whitewashing, and this is a way to redress that. Here is another article, again from a fellow psychologist, that leverages the power of OER to challenge academic gatekeeping. And this ensures not just equitable representation of content, but also equitable representation when it comes to authorship. The final piece of scholarship I will point to over here is the absolutely exceptional work of Cheryl Hodgkinson-Williams and Henry Trotter from the University of Cape Town in advancing a social justice framework for OER in the Global South. And as this table, I'm going to leave this up for a while, is copied directly from their article. And we can start in the second row. But as it outlines, it's within the economic dimension that we deal with maldistribution as the specific injustice. And so this is where we can engage in redistribution, right? Such as with the use of OER. It is a positive move. It is a positive approach. It is what they would call an ameliorative approach. But as they note in the final column, if we wish to not just address injustice, but if we wish to address the root causes of injustice, then we need to go further still and seek a more transformative approach. And so, for example, this might be a change in the manner in which educational materials, textbooks, journals, how they are created, how they are adapted, how they are disseminated, how their production is funded by governments, institutions, donors, for example. Next, if you look at the third row, it is within the cultural dimension that we deal with misrecognition as the specific injustice. And in this case, the ameliorative response, it's positive, could include the creation or localization or redistribution of OER in preferred languages from alternative epistemic stances. But a transformative stance, a transformative response would go further. It would involve dismantling the power relations, the social hierarchies, the cultural hegemonies that currently underpin the canons, the assumed norms, the values of inherited curricula. Who gets to decide what is received knowledge in a given discipline? Challenge that, and then we're talking more about recognitive justice. And finally, it is within the political dimension that we deal with misrepresentation as an injustice. And in this case, the ameliorative response could include a provision for the representation of underrepresented people. That, of course, will create an opportunity for participatory decision-making. But a more transformative approach would provide the opportunity for all relevant stakeholders to decide on what is really important educationally in order to avoid becoming objects of charity or benevolence, or even non-persons with regard to justice. I'm saying a lot over here, and I recognize that some of this, perhaps all of it, will come across more as political activism than a talk about educational practice, but I'm going to suggest that these are one and the same. I draw great inspiration from the great Bell Hooks, who wrote about how her commitment to engaged pedagogy was in fact an expression of political activism. Nothing we do, my friends, is apolitical, especially this work. And perhaps, just perhaps, as I was listening to His Excellency the President yesterday, maybe this is what he referred to as a form of militant tenderness. So it is at this point I would challenge you to articulate for yourself what you understand as the true purpose, or maybe the purposes of higher education. Right? For me, it might be to widen equitable access, to unlock human potential, to support social and economic mobility, to ultimately catalyze societal transformation. And if we follow the theme of the conference, it's to foster resilient societies for sustainable economic development. Now, if we embrace not only the sustainable development goals, but also understand the centrality of quality education in advancing progress towards all of the other SDGs, this becomes even clearer. You can't advance gender equality, responsible consumption, zero hunger without doing it first through education, I would suggest. Now, talking about the SDGs also calls to mind, of course, the importance of rethinking not just our resources, but our entire approach to teaching and learning. And as this important UNESCO publication pointed out, education for sustainable development is not just about integrating contents related to climate change, poverty, sustainable consumption into the curriculum. It demands, I'm saying demands, it says it asks for, but no, it demands an action-oriented, transformative pedagogy. It supports self-directed learning, participation, collaboration, problem orientation, inter- and transdisciplinarity, and the linking of formal and informal learning. Only such pedagogical approaches, it says, makes possible the development of the key competencies for promoting sustainable development. Now, in my mind, this approach, education for sustainable development, has a lot to do with the practice of open pedagogy. Some of you will know about open pedagogy. It was even recognized as one of the important directions forward at the 10th anniversary of the Cape Town Open Education Declaration. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, I will say there are many definitions of this concept. I will share a very recent one that I really quite like. It's become one of my favorites, and it's from a new collection called Pedagogy Opened, Open Access. It says, open pedagogy may be understood as teaching and learning practices and environments that promote equity, collaboration, and innovation, and invite students to create and share knowledge with future publics, often in association with the use of OER. And again, I think about yesterday when the President, His Excellency Duma Gideon Boko, spoke of the importance not just of being consumers of knowledge. He talked about the importance of being creators, generators of knowledge as well. And when you do this with students, not just as academics, that is where open pedagogy comes in. Now, in drawing on the practice of both, on the power of open licensing, but also the tradition of critical pedagogy, open pedagogy foregrounds values such as, of course, access and equity and community and connection, but also very much agency and ownership. And of course, you attend to opportunities and risks. And behind it all is animated empathy, curiosity, responsibility, participation. It's sometimes easier to understand things in relief, in contrast. And I've already heard in some of the sessions yesterday references to the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire. And yes, I would say open pedagogy actively resists what Paulo Freire referred to as the banking model of education, right? This model turns students into containers to be filled by the teacher, and the more completely she fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better the students they are. And so education thus becomes the act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is considered a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. I hope as you're listening to that last paragraph, a part of you is feeling revolted. Now, in practical terms, Embracing open pedagogy might involve co-creating course policies with students, schedules of work with students, giving students a choice of different kinds of ways to demonstrate their achievement of learning outcomes. But one of the most common approaches to embracing open pedagogy involves the design and use of so-called renewable assignments, sometimes called non-disposable assignments. Because unlike traditional, more disposable assignments, which end up typically in the recycling bin, whether you're talking about the digital or the physical recycling bin after the student receives feedback from the instructor, open pedagogy in the form of renewable assignments differs in at least 3 ways. For one, they typically have a larger audience than the instructor. They could, in fact, involve public scholarship. Second, they have a longer life than the academic term. They might even serve as a resource for future cohorts of students, for example. And third, although student learning is always important, they have a greater impact, more gravity, this article would describe it as, than individual student learning. They might even involve the creation of OER. So the prototypical example of a renewable assignment is, of course, the Wikipedia assignment. Many of you are familiar with this, where students, as part of their coursework, either edit or write articles for Wikipedia. This approach is well supported by the Wiki Education Foundation, and it's a wonderful illustration of ways in which students can contribute to the public knowledge commons. And once again, one can take an approach that is more social justice oriented. You can provide, for example, not only just lay summaries of scholarship that would otherwise be inaccessible behind a paywall, make it available to the public. Sure, that helps. But you can go further. You can deliberately look to, let's say, improve the representation of women scientists, articles in Wikipedia, grossly underrepresented at present. That's taking it further. But of course, you can go further still. And as I said earlier, open pedagogy draws on critical pedagogy, which itself asserts that students can engage in their own learning from a position of agency. I'm going to keep using that word through this talk, because this takes seriously the educational imperative to encourage students to act on the knowledge, on the values, on the social relations they acquire by being responsive to the deepest and most important problems of our times. And there's many, but of course, for me, when I think about the deepest and most important problems of our times, especially driving around local Gaborone, I see the building over there with the 17 SDGs. That's what I think of a lot of the time. And so it was a real delight for us when I was at KPU to join what has now become an international, inter-institutional, interdisciplinary open pedagogy fellowship that is squarely focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. So in this program, faculty members from different institutions, different disciplines, they work together. They are bound by an interest commonly in a specific or one or more SDGs that are of interest. They design renewable assignments, they deploy it in their courses over the year, and then students end up really coming to life. In one of my favorite examples over here, which is, as you can see from the 2019 cohort, 3 faculty members, one from urban ecosystems, one from sustainable horticulture, one from anthropology, they had their students map out all of the edible weeds across the university campuses. They contributed scientific quality data to a public database, which of course means a lot of authentic, meaningful learning is taking place while also addressing the SDG of zero hunger. Now, as you might imagine, if you give students an opportunity like this, when they engage with open pedagogy, not only do they experience all of the benefits of authentic assessment, but they pour so much more energy, so much more creativity, so much more passion, pride into this kind of work. It is not busy work. These 2 articles demonstrate this as well. So in the article on the left by Kelly and colleagues, students who choose to publish their work openly via open pedagogy reported significantly less shame, significantly more pride, enjoyment, positive beliefs about writing. In the article on the right by Worth and Williams, a plurality of students, when they were given a choice, they preferred the project on open pedagogy. They indicated that it increased their engagement, but also skills acquisition. And if you're looking for more examples of what does open pedagogy look like in practice, in my discipline, at the course level, at the program level, I encourage you to visit the Open Pedagogy portal. It is created and it's maintained by a group called the Open Education Network, which is now international as well. So while I think it's easy to get excited about open pedagogy, and certainly I'm certainly an advocate for it, because I think it's engaging, it's effective. But even with open pedagogy, it is essential to bring a critical lens to this work, right? It's the same with OER, of course. When you think about OER, it sounds wonderful, but you can make strange choices along the way if you're not doing it critically. You can reproduce hegemonic perspectives. You can engage in gatekeeping around who gets to author OER. You can devalue the labor involved in creating OER by relying only on voluntary labor. You can publish OER that is not accessible without alt text for images, without captions for videos. You can not think about offline alternatives for places without bandwidth, for example. You can do harm with OER, is what I'm trying to say, if you don't think through critically. And so with open educational practices more broadly, my colleagues Mahabali, Catherine Cronin, and I sought to draw on that earlier social justice framework I pointed to from Cheryl and Henry, and extend that framework to broader open educational practices, such as open pedagogy. For example, we outlined how OEP can be neutral or even have a negative effect if it reproduces hegemonic knowledge, if there's insufficient skills scaffolding, if you're asking students to engage in public scholarship without preparing them, and especially protecting them, the more marginalized students, from the risks of public scholarship. You have to think about these things. It can be positive, of course, as it says in the middle, ameliorative. You can certainly address economic injustice. As I said, you can make scholarship accessible to those populations who could not otherwise afford to access it. But it can be transformative. And that's when typically marginalized groups are involved in the design of the content and the processes. And when epistemology and this structural academic gatekeeping that continues to characterize the academy is challenged. We think about this as pedagogy can be more teacher-centric, it can be more student-centric. It can be more content-centric, it can be more process-centric. It can be purely about learning and engagement, or it can be intentionally oriented towards social justice. And it's along those three dimensions that you typically see the difference between open pedagogy that is ameliorative and open pedagogy that is truly transformative. Now, more recently, a few colleagues and I engaged in some experimental research where we systematically manipulated the design of a course to very intentionally integrate these principles. First, redistributive justice, then we added recognitive justice, then on top of that, we layered representational justice. And we did this with manipulating things like course materials. So initially it would be an expensive commercial textbook, then it would be the use of OER, then it would be localized OER, then in fact the localized OER would be co-authored with students. That's an example of going deeper and deeper. The same thing with course assignments. You could have a traditional research essay in an Introduction to Psychology course, or you could do a Wikipedia assignment, or you could do a Wikipedia assignment focused on marginalized group representation, to eventually focusing this explicitly on excluded perspectives. And with course policies, start from relatively standard, strict policies to more inclusive and supportive policies, not just making space for engagement by diverse learners, but also inviting learners to co-create the learning journey. There's that agency piece again. And as our article about this study, which was again recently published in the journal Open Praxis, if you want to dive into this, we provide all of our materials openly if you want to look at this. Increased social justice framing actually led to positive outcomes. It led to an increased desire to stay in that course, register in the course, more positive perceptions of school support and acceptance, better relations with faculty and staff, and higher instructor evaluations. What I'm trying to say is that students can tell when you design intentionally for justice, and they respond. Now, of course, the notion of designing for justice doesn't only extend to course materials, course assignments, or course policies. It also concerns our educational technologies. And today, that necessitates that we bring the same student-centric, process-centric, justice-oriented approach to the proliferation and, I dare say, the infiltration of artificial intelligence. You can tell I was running around town taking pictures. So a couple of days ago, as I stood at the 3 Degozi Monument, I was looking across at the High Court. This, of course, is the statue atop the High Court. It was hard for me not to recognize some parallels. Parallels between the resource-intensive, data-extractive, environmentally damaging, and supposedly irresistible digital colonial force that is AI, with the history of this beautiful country, and the successful challenge mounted in the defense of its own autonomy. Now, there have already been several thoughtful discussions about AI at this conference, posing important critical questions. So let me say this off the bat. I think it's important not to fall prey to the technology hype cycle. Some of you know that back in 1922, Thomas Edison talked about how the motion picture was destined to revolutionize the education system and how just in a few years it would supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. Or more recently, in 1999, when the CEO of Cisco predicted that education over the internet would make email use seem like a rounding error. Or, for that matter, when at the height of the MOOC craze, but maybe it's one and the same, Sebastian Thrun, this co-founder of Udacity, predicted that by 2060 there would be only 10 institutions delivering higher education, and of course that Udacity was likely to be one of them. And forgive me, but I won't bother you either with an inflated quote about blockchain, which in my view continues to be an unsustainable solution in desperate search of a problem, or perhaps even a problem masquerading as a solution. So when you feel the pressure to go all in on AI because of inevitability narratives, or because Bill Gates has said something silly last week, which he does very frequently, mind you, about how all jobs will disappear in the face of AI, or maybe because you see how other institutions, like Arizona State University is a really good example, jumping in with both feet to deploy agentic AI. This is more autonomous AI that requires less human intermediation. So their faculty can now use individual AI agents, and you can see it represented at the bottom of that slide. It's very small, but from left to right, there's one agent that will draft the course outline and learning objectives. There's another agent that will create the syllabus for the course. There's another agent that will create the learning modules, another one that will script the lectures, and another one that will design the assessments. If you're wondering about what's left for the instructor here, you're not alone. But remember, though, that the fear of being left behind is very natural. This is a challenging time for universities across the world, which I would say makes it only more important that we avoid making costly mistakes that are driven by fear. Believe me, there's no shortage of edtech companies which will happily funnel your limited public resources into their balance sheets through a combination of scaremongering and overblown promises. So I agree with Neil Selwyn, who wrote back in 2011 that the current understanding of schools in the digital age is hampered by this curious amnesia, forgetfulness, or even a willful ignorance of past phases of technology development and implementation of schools. At the same time, I will say, I do think that AI is here to stay. I don't think it's feasible, nor is it necessarily desirable to ignore it, but I certainly think it's futile to attempt to prohibit it or ban it in any way. We know, of course, that educators are using AI to support a range of teaching tasks, everything from the brainstorming of ideas for lesson plans and assignments, to simplifying complex topics for students, to supporting accessibility in the classroom. This is from a report from Microsoft, if you're interested in diving in. We also know from the same report that students are using AI to support a range of learning tasks, whether authorized or not, they're still using it, right? And that includes everything from brainstorming to get started with assignments, to summarizing information, to getting initial feedback on their work. And there have been important discussions and developments at the nexus of OER and AI, including, of course, the Dubai Declaration, which pointed to potential opportunities to advance work on OER, whether it's supporting the discovery, translation, curation, indexing of OER. But this declaration also stressed the importance of transparency, equity, inclusivity, and collaboration with GenAI, pointed to the importance of open ecosystems as key to supporting access while protecting intellectual property. I will also highlight the work of Creative Commons over here, which is working right now on CC signals. This will allow dataset holders to signal their preferences for how their content may be used by machines based on a limited set but meaningful options that are shaped in the public interest. These CC signals are both meant to be a technical and legal tool, but also a social proposition ultimately. It's a call for a new pact between those who share data and those who use it to train AI models. And these are important conversations to have, but I would also say it's important to acknowledge that the Silicon Valley narrative of move fast and break things, as they say, is not a particularly ethical approach in higher education. Unlike venture capital funded firms in Silicon Valley, we cannot simply do harm, apologize, and roll back our programs if there's an uproar. We cannot simply shut down our organization and spin up a new university with the same board of directors. We cannot develop and sustain models that are exploitative of our students and devastating to our communities. The Valley's reliance on venture capital funding and its obsession with unicorns means that the pressure to prioritize revenue over ethics is always very strong. This is why Silicon Valley is flush with exploitative business models, and which is why I personally cringe when I hear edtech vendors describing their products as being Uber for this or Netflix for that, or unnecessarily and uncritically injecting the latest buzzword tech into their products to try to make their shareholders smile. Blockchain, NFTs, God forbid, you remember that one? Or Gen AI. We need to be slower. What I'm saying. We need to be more careful, we need to be more responsible, and much more ethical, especially when we're talking about student data. Haney Farid, who is a computer scientist professor at Dartmouth College, wrote, if a biologist said, here's a really cool virus, let's see what happens when the public gets their hands on it, that would not be acceptable. And yet, it's precisely what Silicon Valley does all the time. It's indicative, they wrote, of a very immature industry. We have to understand the harm, we have to slow down on how we deploy technology like this. And as Ruha Benjamin writes in her important book, Race After Technology, it's only by pulling back the curtain and drawing attention to forms of coded inequity. Not only do we become more aware of the social dimensions of technology, but that's when we can work together against the emergence of a digital caste system that relies on our naivety when it comes to the neutrality of technology. I think that last phrase is incredibly important to underscore. Whether it's with AI or any other tech, they rely on our naivety and the assumption that technology is neutral. We live in the era of platform capitalism, where platforms like Google and Amazon operate digital infrastructure that serves as the foundation for others to conduct business, facilitate transactions, interact with users. But this means that these platforms often rely on massive amounts of user data and can evolve into powerful monopolies. We also live in the era of surveillance capitalism. This is a new economic order that claims human experience as the free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. So as we seek to redesign and deliver open education worldwide, I think it's increasingly necessary to ask ourselves whether, as this illustration by the talented Brian Mathers suggests, are we surfing the open web or are we in fact serfs in a feudal web? For me, one of the paths forward is to embrace the principles of design justice. And there's many of them, but there's three I'll highlight here. Design to sustain, to heal, to empower our communities. Seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. Prioritize design's impact on the community over the intentions of the designer. This is where you do no harm. And center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes in the design process. And that final principle is one of the reasons why, for me, this is one of the most interesting university documents to come out of recent discussions about AI. This is the Student Manifesto for Assessment in the Age of AI from students at the London School of Economics. I really recommend you look at this because it demonstrates, first of all, how mature student perspectives are. It demonstrates how they readily recognize the limitations and biases of AI, how they are attentive to inequitable access, and how they really wish to work towards a culture of transparency and trust. Now, of course, if you look at the column on the left, inequitable access, amplification of societal biases, and lack of transparency are just three of many ethical considerations with AI, and this is not even an exhaustive list. That would have to be a separate keynote. We need to think critically about privacy and data sovereignty. We need to think about the protection of intellectual property. We need to stop paying lip service to the environmental impact of Gen AI use. As a colleague recently said at an AI conference I attended, if it takes 2 cups of water, which is an approximation, to support an entire interaction with ChatGPT, let's say about 20 to 30 prompts, when we casually use this platform, maybe we should be thinking about whose 2 cups of water we are using. There are legal implications over here, right? Everything from accountability and governance to misrepresentation and liability. For example, academic advising chatbots that give inaccurate advice to learners is just one example. We can talk about labor, both in terms of the employment of individuals across the global south to moderate and screen traumatizing content on AI platforms, as well, of course, as the displacement of skilled labor. There are questions also about the inadvertent de-skilling that occurs when learners uncritically engage in cognitive offloading, when they avoid what psychologists would say is a desirable difficulty. You want learners to struggle through that learning process. It's the real sweat of learning that cements the memory process. This is why we must support not only critical AI literacy, which is no silver bullet, but also emphasize metacognitive skills. And finally, I will reference on the bottom right the paradox of participation. This is maybe less widely known, but this reflects the bind that many different groups find themselves in with regard to AI. If you, for example, do not contribute to the corpus of AI, of data that trains AI models, you may find yourself locked out, effectively erased from future search engines. But if you do contribute, you may have to give up your intellectual property and data sovereignty on the way, which is problematic, particularly in the case of, for example, indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge. So these are the critical questions, I think, of this time, and why I recommend that you also look at this valuable new resource from UNESCO about AI and the future of education. It includes, I should note, several critical contributions, including from some of the attendees at this conference. Shout out to Paul Prinsloo, by the way, who's somewhere in the back of the room. I think I see you there, my friend. And I will say, you've not just been an important intellectual leader within this community, but I'm going to say an important moral leader as well. So thank you for your continued work. So as Laurie Phipps and Donna Lanclough have reminded us, EdTech will not save us, folks. Certainly AI will not save us. So while some will excitedly point to the possibilities of creating, localizing, translating, enriching open content, they will even salivate at the thought of all of the gains and efficiencies. Isn't that the buzzword? And all of the data extraction that comes from unabashedly embracing platform capitalism. I will urge a degree of caution, because there are many paradoxes with AI. With AI, for example, you can see a great race to make knowledge available more widely. But it's curiously done in a way that makes hallucinations and misinformation widely available as well. There is a race to provide more personalized education, but curiously in a way that excludes the humans and makes it incredibly impersonal. There is so much rhetoric around the democratization of education, and yet what we actually see is an oligopoly and the privatization of education through a philosophy of neoliberalism. You see a strong desire to draw on as large a corpus of data as possible to train AI, but it's done in a way that steals intellectual property from writers, from artists, from scholars. You hear promises about widening access, but you can see the many ways in which AI is in fact widening inequities. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that there are no good possibilities over here, but the risks are significant. And without engaging with AI critically, including considering whether it's in fact appropriate or not to even engage with AI, we will do harm. This is also why I think one of the most interesting paradoxes with AI is that as a desire for greater technology adoption escalates, what actually becomes ever more essential is humanistic education. What we need here is more critical thinking, more ethical reasoning, more collaboration, more communication, more humanity. And I will say this, please do not let people gaslight you into thinking that if you adopt a critical mindset with AI, that somehow you are anti-tech, anti-progress, stuck in the mud, denialist, traditionalist. That is quite simply an intellectually dishonest critique. So as Martin Weller wrote in his book, 25 Years of EdTech, one can still be enthusiastic about the application of technology to benefit learners while being aware of the broader implications, questioning claims, and advocating and conducting research about real impacts. So as I close, I will leave you with a few prompts for self-reflection. First, as educators, I would urge you to resist inevitability narratives, to proceed with warranted caution, to ideally design for justice, but at the very least, avoid doing harm. Remember that when people talk about pedagogy coming before technology, technologies actually influence and define the pedagogy that's instantiated within the learning and instructional designs. And as Tim Fawns points out, technology is actually entangled within pedagogy. So it's not possible to first choose a pedagogy and then tack on a technology, or even have pedagogy tacked on to technology. You need to think about them side by side. Remember that if we do not foreground access, equity, and justice, we are in fact abdicating our core responsibility as educators. Open education is far more than just being about access. I've talked about agency. So think about enhancing learner agency and not just availing of and unleashing unrestricted agentic AI. There's going to be lots of questions. That would be an entirely different session as well about assessment in the age of AI. I will only remind you that assessment for learning is just as valuable, perhaps more valuable than assessment of learning. This is a time where formative and open assessments become more valuable, where we should be thinking about the concept of academic integrity in a different way, recognize that we need to move past historical understandings of cheating and plagiarism at a time when AI-human hybrid writing is increasingly common. And finally, do everything in your power to push back against this prevailing transactional model of education, because education is at its best when it is empowering, liberatory, and transformative. We can innovate in open education with OER. I'll move this back, with open pedagogy, with open educational technologies. But if we wish to do that in a way that fosters resilient societies, that supports sustainable economic development, we must take a critical approach. Otherwise, we will risk undermining the very values that drive our work. We can easily end up widening inequities, losing control of our data and intellectual property, amplifying societal biases, and accelerating climate change, while at the same time de-skilling future generations. So I would think carefully about the world that we wish to build. What I'm saying is, do not sell our souls on the road to greater efficiency. If we uncritically adopt the techno-sludge that Silicon Valley excretes, we could easily find ourselves in a world where students are submitting AI-generated content and assignments that is then graded and marked by AI-driven grading platforms. It's all spectacularly efficient, but it has nothing to do with the real business of education. And when we talk about the real business of education, the real work of change, this is what happens students by students, classroom by classroom, course by course. And it is this change that's implemented by educators who have committed to teaching, because it and their students matter. Thank you very much for your attention, everybody. I appreciate it very much.